So just a quick word about me. Many of you probably know about Voxbone. Voxbone's a VoIP DID wholesaler. I actually lead up a group at Voxbone that focuses on the non-PSTN SIP trunking stuff, like some offerings for our CPaaS customers and WebRTC. I've also been involved with WebRTC for quite a while. I edit a blog and post to WebRTC Hacks, which we try to be a good resource for WebRTC developers out there with a lot of great technical content and some code guides. And also pretty involved. I actually run some WebRTC events also, backed by Google and some other big sponsors too. So I figured I'd start. I don't know, how familiar are people in the room with WebRTC? I assume probably people have a decent idea what it is already. But I thought maybe for those who aren't, I'd just do a really quick recap, and then we can dive into some of the more recent changes and challenges and how to overcome some of the challenges. So WebRTC started 5 years ago when Google acquired a bunch of companies and assets and then turned around and open sourced it. Right, into the WebRTC project. At the same time, they introduced WebRTC to the W3C, which standardizes the web, and the IETF to turn WebRTC into a standard by itself, based around a lot of the components and elements of that architecture, really to be the future of the future VoIP engine. WebRTC includes 3 main APIs. The first one is part of a stream capture. The main functions are grabbing your camera, your microphone, but it also includes doing things like grabbing portions of a screen or helping with screen sharing. Right. The second main API is a peer connection. This is what actually allows you to do peer-to-peer connectivity through a network, and we'll go into some of the other details around that. And the third one, which is often, I think, overlooked or maybe underlooked, is a data connection, which actually allows you to send peer-to-peer data, right? So the peer connection, a lot of it's optimized for real-time communications, but you can also send arbitrary data peer-to-peer too. And this opens up a whole new realm of applications and use cases, leveraging a lot of the same technologies underneath. So WebRTC is really a state-of-the-art technology. So through the standards, they really try to incorporate the latest and greatest in firewall and NAT traversal, flow control mechanisms for high quality audio and video over the internet, specifically mandatory encryption that's required. And they do all this without actually requiring or standardizing any signaling. They leave that open to the developer. And at the same time, Google, with the help of Mozilla and now others like Microsoft and the large open source community out there, has really developed a really big community around WebRTC, right? And all this has happened in 5 years, right? And if you're excited about, if you like VoIP technology, I think this is pretty good. So what's next? Who's using this? What's the outcome? So by far, probably the biggest user of WebRTC today is Facebook with their Messenger product. And they just announced a few weeks ago they have 300 million monthly active users, right? So that's not total users, it's just monthly active users they count just using voice and video on Messenger, right? And this is less than 3 years since they launched the service. And they've really only been pushing it pretty hard, I'd say, in the last year or so. All right, so this is massive numbers. Obviously, Facebook has a really big user base to start from with 1 billion users. But still, I think it's hard to argue that WebRTC is immature when you have 300 million monthly active users in the world's largest social network using it that heavily. All right. Another big user, obviously, Google started this whole thing. They are a big user of it. Hangouts was really one of their initial applications, but a lot of people don't realize if you know the Google Cast, or what was known as Chromecast before, actually leverages pieces of the WebRTC engine to share your screen to your, or you basically share your mobile phone screen, your computer screen, or tab to your TV, through this dongle they plug in, right? And they run a couple other different projects that leverage pieces of WebRTC, some of the data channel elements as part of their uProxy initiative, and some of their Google Play game services that they offer too. Their latest application is Google Duo, if you heard of, and this is also all based on WebRTC under the hood, with some advancements. So and they say they have a lot more in the works. Another big one, I'm not sure if this is a big Snapchat crowd, but if you use Snapchat and you hold down on a picture of someone and it initiates a video conversation, that's all based on WebRTC. And even Skype is jumping into the WebRTC game, right? I'll talk a lot more about Microsoft and their role. I mean, they have a lot of different media engines going on there. But they're using WebRTC or a variant of WebRTC known as ORTC that we'll talk about in a little bit as part of Skype for web integration on Windows 10 with the Edge browser. They're actually even using WebRTC to power their Linux version of Skype now. So they're leveraging WebRTC in a lot of different ways. And if you're an old school telephony person, you probably have WebRTC as part of your portfolio or usage somehow, right? All the major vendors and kind of big telcos have some sort of initiative around it. I won't necessarily say they all have a lot of traction yet, but everyone's doing something there. And definitely the open source telephony community is also big on this also. So you add all this up after 5 years, and these are some stats that Google gave on the 5-year anniversary a few months back, right? There's 2 billion browsers using this now, 1 billion minutes a week they report, close to probably about 1,000 companies actually in total at this point. A lot of app downloads, and actually they reported a significant volume of data channel usage even going through their network. And this is just stats that Google reports, that they have data points they have access to, right? So they can get, when you opt in to send, say OK, they'll allow Google to collect stats from the browser. Some of that stuff is going in here. And this also includes, Android, Play Store type downloads of some of the applications out there. So that's all good. Let's talk about some of the bad news, or I guess not so good, or not as great news of WebRTC, and some of the things that are slowing it down from being even faster and even more broadly used. And by far, the biggest pain in the ass with WebRTC is Apple, right? And Apple hurts WebRTC in a couple ways. First, they don't support WebRTC in Safari at all, right? Safari is the dominant browser used on iOS devices. It's a very popular browser, even used on OS X, if not the exclusive one. The bigger issue, they also don't support WebRTC in their web view. So if you're an iOS developer and you want to simply leverage some of the web code that you have and put that into your application, you can't do that because the web view that Apple requires doesn't support WebRTC. And probably one of the worst ones that if you're using an iOS device and you want to use Chrome or you want to use another browser like Firefox, it actually does not support, they can't actually add WebRTC support to that because Apple's policy states that you need to use their web rendering engine, which is known as WebKit, and WebKit does not support WebRTC, right? So Google can't use its own web rendering engine, even though I'm sure they believe it's better. With the way the iOS policy stated, they're not allowed to do that. So therefore, on iOS devices at least, the browser you don't actually get any WebRTC support. And depending on your audience and who you care about, this may or may not be a big deal. Maybe you can get away with just supporting Android, but in most cases you can't. So if you want to support iOS users, especially, you need to have some sort of native mobile application or some application as part of the Apple App Store, right? Which adds a lot more work and complexity, right? So while Apple has been out promoting AirPods and trying to get you to lose them, so you can spend another $60 to buy a new set. This is how Facebook actually handles when you try to do a video call through Messenger to someone else using Safari. They basically come up and tell you to use a different browser. Right? So Apple's not completely deaf. They actually do have WebRTC in development as part of the WebKit rendering engine that I talked about. This has been in the works for some time. There's no real firm timelines on when this will come out. Apple being Apple doesn't really tell you anything, But eventually, this WebKit engine will make its way into the lower level iOS APIs, so you can build it into native apps and should make its way into Safari. We just don't know when, but it is in the works, right? And that's good news. Another big vendor, a big area that's been a challenge for a lot of people in the past has been Microsoft. And Microsoft's actually come quite a long way. Microsoft's efforts around WebRTC originally really centered around its new Edge browser, which is built into Windows 10. And you can see some of their stats here. I mean, they have support. I'll talk a little bit. I mean, early on, a lot of people thought Microsoft was against WebRTC because they were backing ORTC, which is a kind of alternative version of WebRTC. It's now essentially the new version of it. But Microsoft actually has gone back and supported the 1.0 version that works with Chrome and Firefox today too. So they're coming along. The challenge with Edge is that it's a new browser. Depending on your perspective, you could say that Windows 10 is doing well, or you could say it's doing awful. But the reality is Edge is still a pretty small portion of the overall population, particularly within the especially within the Microsoft ecosystem overall, right? So it's growing, but it's tiny. And the bigger browser that everyone usually cares about is Internet Explorer, and Microsoft is essentially capped or has capped all new features and development on Internet Explorer. So that means there's no native WebRTC support on IE. There are some workarounds to that. There's some freely available plugins from like one vendor called Temesis, and some others who have plugins that can work with Internet Explorer. That's a kind of a stopgap type solution, certainly not long term, but that's the reality of it. However, in addition to the browser support, Edge, as I mentioned earlier, Skype is a user, and more recently, Microsoft has been adding tools for native window apps and Windows developers, .NET developers, to incorporate WebRTC. And this is pretty new. This just happened over the last couple of months. But this should also help push a lot more people within that big Microsoft community, which is often tends to be very enterprise, more business focused in their applications, to start using WebRTC a lot more. Right. So some of the other challenges are, how do you get people up and going with WebRTC? Can novices use it? The answer is yes. There are a lot of really good resources out there. I mean, Google has at least part-time developer advocate that helps put together a lot of things. There's a really good code lab. There's a plethora of videos out there. There's blogs like WebRTC Hacks I write, and a bunch of others that help you get through things. So there's a lot of samples. It's not impossible to get going. But the reality is the Hello World app is something like 220 lines of code, right? Again, this is using the native JavaScript APIs, right? So it's not for the faint of heart. And this is a lot more than doing most other things like playing around with HTML Canvas, where even web audio is fewer lines of code than this. So inherently, because of real-time communications and the way it works, and because the flexibility that's built into the APIs, it's not necessarily easy for someone who's just a web developer and hasn't worked with telephony before to get going. Right? And what does this mean? It means you need to learn, right? There's a lot of other very popular frameworks that have evolved or matured over time to help with other aspects of web development. WebRTC is not really there yet, right? There's no like jQuery for WebRTC yet. There's a bunch of probably competitors or contenders out there. I wouldn't say anyone's really standing out at this point. There definitely are libraries that let you get going with WebRTC in just a couple lines of code where you don't really need to know much, right? But there's no standard framework yet. Perhaps this will develop, but it's not there. So in the meantime, if there's no open source options, there's certainly plenty of vendors out there and open source platforms that have their own approach, their own technique to doing this. One thing that's often forgot a lot too with WebRTC, because it talked a lot about peer-to-peer, right? And it's browser-based. People think about the browser, right? And what can I code? And I can do all that stuff inside my web browser or in my mobile app. They forget WebRTC still needs servers. I think for most of this crowd, you understand servers and what they do, since Asterisk is a server-based element. But one of the major elements that people forget all the time that causes a lot of quality issues, and I'd say this is true if you're a web developer and even in the telephony community is turn servers, right? So Asterisk can function like an SBC to help with NAT and firewall traversal. A lot of those mechanisms are built in through ICE, which I won't go through all the mechanism, the details here on the business track for how all this works, but essentially all that gets encapsulated in a turn server, right, which allows you to reuse web ports and lets you very easily get through firewalls without having to do any kind of special configuration in the end, right? But you need to have this turn server for the number, relatively small number of cases where you need that, right? And this is one provider out there, TalkBox, who shared some stats. You can see their numbers range from 6 to 14% of all their calls require this turn server element. I've heard other vendors say up to 25 or 30%. I can say at Voxbone we're only 4% of our users actually need a turn server. So it does vary depending on your environment and where your customers are and their firewall configurations and setup. But at the end of the day, don't forget a turn server. Otherwise, you're going to have whatever percentage it is of users that don't connect as a result. Setting one up is actually not too difficult to do yourself, and there's a number of services out there that can help you do it too. Another big area that I see a lot of, I see even more in kind of the telephony community gets hung up on is getting SSL certificates or TLS certificates for your website where you run WebRTC. Chrome actually requires that you do, that you actually run over HTTPS or secure origin to capture the video and microphone. It won't work without it, right? So be prepared. You need to run, get an SSL certificate for your website if you want to use WebRTC. Codecs was a big issue in the past. I mean, this was largely resolved in standards by requiring that the browser vendors support both VP8 and H.264. So the question was afterwards, will everyone actually go out and support H.264 and implement this? And there were some people that questioned if Google would actually follow through. Well, they have actually. H.264 is now available inside Chrome. It's been there as part of Firefox. And actually, if you get the latest insider preview, actually might be in the GA build now, with Edge, H.264 support is there too, right? So that's one item that if you want to have codec support, I mean, there's still plenty of complexities around what codecs you might want to use for different options, but in general, H.264 is the safe bet and everyone supports it. All right, the next topic, let's talk a little bit about standards, right? And I mentioned earlier, the debate of WebRTC versus ORTC. And one of the things that really happened over the last year was there was agreement that the next version of WebRTC called NV should incorporate the objects from ORTC, right? ORTC is called Object ORTC. WebRTC today uses SDP, which many of you I'm sure are familiar with. It leverages that mechanism. ORTC gets rid of SDP and basically just uses, allows much more granular object API access to control those things that are usually communicated via SDP natively via the API, right? So, and there was a lot of debate over when the best way to do things. Now that WebRTC 1.0, they're calling it, the existing standard is largely done, and we'll talk about that in a second. Going forward, the next version of WebRTC is going to incorporate some of these newer ORTC APIs. Right? And actually, many of these newer ORTC APIs are already in WebRTC 1.0 and have been built in there over time. And I won't go through all the details, right? But these let you do things like get your media path going while the track's still ringing, right? You can change codecs and do a lot of things without having to deal with all the SDP negotiation back and forth, which can speed things up, and it actually makes it a lot easier to do certain applications where you might just want to have, as soon as you plug in a camera, have it immediately send a stream without having to deal with negotiation, right? So a lot of this stuff is already in WebRTC, and then WebRTC NV will include even more, actually, the complete set of objects that have been defined under that ORTC standard, which has kind of been working in parallel with WebRTC, right? In parallel, but also in collaboration. So, and the good news, I mentioned there's a couple different API sets. Probably the one that grabbing camera, microphone, screen sharing. The media capture and streams spec is basically ready to go. It's a candidate recommendation, which means essentially everyone is good with it. However, the other one, the WebRTC 1.0, which includes the peer connection and the data connection, the data channel APIs, that has been a perpetual working draft for a long time. I think most of the core standards and elements have been agreed upon for some time, but WebRTC is not like an island by itself. It's part of the larger web community. So, and certain aspects of underlying JavaScript have been evolving. So whenever that stuff changes, basically the WebRTC needs to go back and incorporate some of that, right? So that's one aspect. Some of these object APIs were another kind of sticking point for many of the proponents or representatives as part of the standards bodies, where they needed to have some of these things, and they wanted to make sure some of those APIs were included as part of WebRTC 1.0. And then probably the third main area that's been a sticking point is dealing with some of the more advanced multi-party calling scenarios out there, which can get a lot more complex and are hard to deal with in SDP. So it makes things a little complex there. For the vast majority of users and use cases, though, unless you're in one of those camps where you're dealing with complex multi-party video scenarios and MCUs and SFUs, in most cases, what's in the current spec is effectively done and has been pretty standard and mature for some time, and there's not a lot of changes there. But still, I mean, I think everyone was hoping the standard would have been done 6 months ago, and every time I asked the standards people, when's this going to be ready? Like 6 months, and every 6 months it's another 6 months, right? So, but I guess we probably shouldn't get too worked up about standards or some of the problems. I mean, the reality is, as I mentioned earlier, WebRTC is really crushing it, right? If you compare it to other previous VoIP technologies, and I did some quick research to see how how did Skype do after 5 years with that, or how did VoLTE or IMS or RCS and kind of the telco world do after 5 years. WebRTC is really killing it, right? Both in terms of active users, but also in terms of supported devices, right? And some of this is comparing a little bit apples to oranges here. The reality is WebRTC is way more places, way more accessible, way easier to use than any other VoIP technology before, and as a result, it has more usage, right? And it's going to continue to grow. And the WebRTC community itself, I actually just pulled this a week or so ago, looking at GitHub to look at code contributors, new code contributors per month, right? People actually pushing code that contains some WebRTC element in it, and that continues to go up, right? So, and this is again unique per month. So if I put this at in an aggregate number to show total number of users, it'd be a pretty big number. So use WebRTC, but I guess there's a couple things to keep in mind before you leap, right? You definitely need to be prepared, and unfortunately, there's a bunch of the techniques and methods for developing effective WebRTC services are starting to get more widely known, communicated, and mature too. One of those is this thing called Adapter.js. That's part of the standard project, right? This helps you deal with the fact that the underlying APIs are changing, and the individual browser vendors have unique differences, right? If you go and you use this Adapter.js as part of your code, it'll let you use the same your same JavaScript application to talk to Chrome, to Firefox, and Edge. Right, so use that. Another big piece here too is keep in mind these browsers like Chrome, they have and Firefox, they have 6 to 8 week update cycles. They're going to go and change things, right? If you pay really close attention, you might be able to pick up what they're doing. If you don't pay attention, then they might change something that could break your application or service, right? The way to get around this is that you need to be part of their development channels, right? So in the case of Chrome, they have a beta version, right? And then they have a development version, right? And these are the ways that you can preview and test your application and test the newer features and capabilities that that are in those new versions before they come to market, right? Chrome even has, and this is same is true with Mozilla. On Firefox, Chrome has a canary version which has experimental features, lets you see a lot of things. So If you're not using these versions as part of your development, then you're playing kind of the waiting game, and then you're hoping when things get deployed it doesn't break, right? You need to be using these early versions, and I'll give you preview, at least some insight. If it's going to break your application in the beta version, at least then you have 6 to 8 weeks to fix it before it goes GA. In most cases, the problems and things that happen, I wouldn't say are super critical or that hard to fix, but you never know based on your own individual architecture. Along those same lines, you might have heard of continuous development or continuous deployment, right? This concept really centered around web applications. But it's important that you have this ability to automate your testing and always be pushing out the latest version rather than going from a waterfall type approach to release management to basically just be releasing things all the time, right? Because of the constant, the changing state of WebRTC, and because the browsers are changing every 6 weeks, and because there's 3 or 4 of them that you need to support, having a process and methodology to be able to just push things out and be, be confident that it works because you've automated the testing is really important. This is another important one, especially for kind of the more telephony-oriented type people, right? Traditional telecom networks, or even enterprise networks, someone else took care of the phone, right? You had some different phone vendor, you plugged in the phone, sure there's some configuration you have to deal with, but the phone, the user interface, like that was all somebody else's problem. When you move to WebRTC, there is no phone, right? There's no signaling mechanism. You can use SIP, but it's not built in there the way to communicate between a client and the service. So this is both an opportunity and a challenge, right? It's an opportunity for people to, for those core telephony developers to get to know their customers and understand what they need and actually understand the user interaction and find the real value. The challenge is, though, you actually have to go out and build that user interface, that user interaction, right, and be much more closely or integrally involved with some of those elements than you've had to be in the past, right? So this has worked well for companies like Facebook and Google, who kind of have the web development background. This has been a much harder challenge, I think, for a lot of traditional telecom companies, which they're not staffed up to have front-end developers to be able to deal with these types of issues, right? And along with that, it is important to get a lot more front-end development capabilities to complement the back-end web server capabilities and the back-end telephony capabilities that you have already. Another big sticking area oftentimes is mobile. Native mobile development is harder for most people, at least, than doing the web development. If you just care about the Android audience, and maybe it doesn't matter, right? You could do a mobile web app, jumping from a large format web page to a more responsive, smaller mobile web app is not that big a deal. But for iOS, for reasons I talked about earlier, that's not an option, right? Fortunately, there's a number of hybrid mobile development frameworks, they're called, right, that essentially let you use a lot of the same web code to make it look and work like a native app inside your application, right? And there, in addition to that, the source code base, WebRTC.org, they've done a lot of work to make building and developing WebRTC for native applications way easier than it was even a couple of years ago, or even a year ago, right? So things are getting a lot better there, even for mobile developers. And I'd say the last thing to remember with WebRTC is be part of the community, right? It's a big community. There's so many different resources and places to go. There's a great Google discussion group that's not just Google, that includes everyone to help people get going. So I think most people here are part of one of these communities or both of these communities already. So this really does help to keep WebRTC going, make it better, and it helps everyone learn from others' mistakes, so we don't have everyone repeating them individually. So that was my main presentation. All right, thanks.